Kirby and the Forgotten Land, known in Japan as Hoshi no Kabi Discovery or Kirby of the Stars Discovery, is a 3D platform-style game for the Nintendo Switch. The game was developed by HAL Laboratory and released worldwide a few weeks back on March 25th, 2022. The big selling point of this particular entry in the mainline Kirby series is of course that it is the very first full 3D platformer for the pink puffball, which is honestly really surprising given the sheer number of Kirby games we've had over the years. As some of you may be aware, I do happen to be someone who enjoys a good Kirby game, and I've even reviewed a few on my channel in the past, Kirby's Dream Land 3 and Kirby 64, so I was really excited to see how a full 3D Kirby game would play. As far as how it actually did play, well, as luck would have it, that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, so I guess without further ado, let's just get into the review of Kirby and the Forgotten Land. So, when we start up Kirby and the Forgotten Land for the first time, we're dropped right into a pre-rendered cutscene that sets the stage for what's going on in the story of this installment of the Kirby series. Kirby's just minding his own business, going for a nice stroll around Popstar, when a literal dimensional rift opens up and he, along with many residents of Popstar, are sucked in and transported to a strange land. Kirby wakes up on a beach, and the game begins. It's a really short and sweet cinematic that does serve as a decent enough motivator to the player. It makes us want to figure out what this giant dimensional rift was formed by, as well as what happened to our many friends and enemies that were sucked through it. These are the key goals of the journey we're about to embark on, and this cutscene sets them up right away, and I really like that. However, something I don't like about this cutscene are the visuals. The weird contrast between some of the smoother models like Kirby himself and the super intricate grass and clouds is very off-putting in my opinion. It reminds me a lot of the Balan Wonderworld cutscenes, which I really didn't like from a visual standpoint. And I guess every other possible standpoint as well, but that's beside the point. The different levels and types of detail among the various models clash in a really weird way that makes the cutscene appear, at least to my eye, to be very amateurish. I'm sorry, but it just doesn't look good in my opinion. Luckily, there's only a few of these pre-rendered cutscenes throughout the game, with the rest just being normal in-engine cinematics, which look much better in my opinion. Next up, let's talk about the story. Now, if you're familiar with the way that I usually review games, you'll know I tend to go down the route of spoilers when it comes to a game's story. However, from now on, if I'm reviewing a new game like Kirby and the Forgotten Land here, I'm just going to speak in general terms and try my best to avoid spoiling you guys. So with that said, how was the story of Kirby and the Forgotten Land? Well, it was really good. Like many of Nintendo's other big-time releases, this game focuses on a passive style of storytelling. You'll find little bits and pieces of lore here and there from things like descriptions of gacha figures, the settings of the various areas, the enemies you're facing, and optional conversations with NPCs. It's up to you to decide to put the pieces of the puzzle together in your own way, and I really love that kind of approach to a game's story, especially for a platformer like this. Now, of course, there are elements of active storytelling here as well, like cutscenes, but you only get so much information from the very few cutscenes in the game, even fewer of which actually have dialogue. The focus here is on the passive side of things for sure, and I really like that decision. Now, as for how I felt about the actual story here, I very much enjoyed it. More so than I was expecting to by a large margin. I haven't played any of the recent Kirby games, I'm more of an old school kind of guy, so I wasn't expecting the level of depth and attention to detail that we got here, and that was a very welcome surprise. By the end of the game, I actually felt like I had a firm grasp on what was going on here, and that was something new for me when it comes to Kirby. In particular, the end of the main story and the post-main story stuff was just, chef's kiss. I won't get into any particulars because you should really experience it for yourself, so I'll just say it was the best and most satisfying story and ending experience I've had in a Kirby game, bar none. Like I said, I was not expecting to get as invested in the story as I did, but by the end I just couldn't wait to see how things turned out. I never thought I'd recommend you play a Kirby game just for the story, but here we are. However, the story's not the only thing that I enjoyed about Kirby and the Forgotten Land. The gameplay was also top-notch. As I mentioned before, this is the first full 3D platformer for Kirby, and without a doubt this was the right way to evolve the Kirby formula. The transition to 3D just feels so natural, like the Kirby franchise was designed to eventually lead here. It evokes the same feeling as when I first played games like Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, both games that made you feel like their series belonged in a 3D space. It's a mystery to me why they didn't make the jump sooner, but I guess all that really matters here is that we eventually got our full 3D Kirby game. As far as how the levels in this game work, there are a bunch of worlds, each with a few main levels and a bunch of side missions. For the most part, the worlds are based on many of the classic platformer themes like sand, ice, ocean, and grassland, but there was at least one really outside-the-box world that was probably my favorite just because of how unique it was. It's a pretty early world at third, if I'm remembering correctly, and that is the Wonderia Remains. The levels here are all themed around the idea of an abandoned theme park, and each one takes place in a different attraction. The attractions range from a spooky haunted house, which I adored by the way, to a parade of robot animatronics that's still going even though the park is long abandoned. The setting and atmosphere in all the levels of this place were just so good. They really nailed the whole theme park ruins vibe, and that alone made every level an absolute joy to play. That's not to say that I didn't have fun with the other worlds in the game, though. In fact, that's anything but the case here. Every single world was so unique from the last, and they were all a ton of fun. I actually can't tell you a single one that I disliked. One thing I will say is that I would have liked some more outside-of-the-box worlds like Wonderia, but that's really a very minor complaint, especially seeing as each individual level within the worlds had a unique theme that set it apart from the rest. For example, in the beach world, which is the second world overall, you go from a rather normal beach area to what appears to be a submerged power plant, then to a giant cement factory with lots of verticality, and finally we go inside a building now filled with rushing water and lots of whirlpools. And this is one of the worst worlds when it comes to variety. Obviously, there's a clear theme here and that is recognizable throughout each level, but to be able to get as much variety as the developers did while working within the confines of the various themes of each world is really something to be proud of in my opinion. Now, in terms of what you actually do in each of these levels across Kirby and the Forgotten Land, well, the main goal, as it is in many a platformer, is simply to get to the end of the level. The end of the level in this case is denoted by a golden cage filled with several Waddle Dees. Waddle Dees are essentially this game's version of a main collectible like stars or jiggies. However, unlike stars or jiggies, as you rescue Waddle Dees, they will rebuild the hub area of this game known as Waddle Dee Town. They'll build stuff like a pond for fishing, a restaurant, and even a coliseum. This is a great incentive to players to really try to find all the various Waddle Dees of each level. Now, each level on its own will have a variable number of Waddle Dees, but the number of tasks here is the same for each. Number 1, reach the end and open the golden cage. Number 2, find some number of hidden Waddle Dees in silver cages. And number 3, complete the 3 hidden tasks that can be literally anything. A few examples of these tasks are find a hidden area, collect or break all of a certain object in a level, complete a boss fight in a set amount of time, take a nap, so on and so forth. In my experience, you basically never make it through a level on the first try with all the challenges done. Luckily though, when you beat a level, it will reveal one hidden challenge that you haven't completed yet to help you out. This is a great system in my opinion because it stops you from having to play the same level over and over again because you have no idea what to do, but still keeps things mysterious on the first playthrough of a level. With this system, the most you'll have to play a level is probably 3 times, but the norm was definitely 2 for me. Another type of collectible you'll find while platforming your way through the numerous levels of Kirby and the Forgotten Land are the gacha figures, spelled gacha like got you. This is a reference to Japanese gacha machines, spelled differently, that dispense small toys and things in return for a coin or two. Think capsule toys. You can find these capsules in a variety of places within a level, like in boxes or on high peaks, but they can also be bought in Waddle Dee Town in exchange for star coins, this game's base currency that gets constantly thrown at you like coins or notes. Like I already mentioned, I really liked the lore that came along with these figures, but that's only true of the 3-star and above figures because 1 and 2 stars don't give you anything in the ways of lore, which was a bit of a disappointment personally. The figures themselves were all really cool to check out though. Let's change gears now and discuss the actual moment-to-moment gameplay here. Like many other games in the Kirby series, the biggest element of moment-to-moment gameplay are the power-ups that can be gained by sucking up specific enemies within a stage. Most of the base power-ups will be familiar if you've played a Kirby game before, but when we get into the realm of power-up evolution, that's where things really get interesting. Evolution becomes possible by finding yet another type of collectible in this game called blueprints, that are pretty straightforward in how they work. Just give them to the Waddle Dee in the workshop, and he'll let you evolve the corresponding power-up to a specific level. Each power has an average of 3 total levels, with some outliers having 4, but those are few and far between. The evolutions are a really cool and satisfying element of this game, so I won't spoil anything good, but one example of an evolution that happens relatively early on is the sword power-up becoming the Gigant Sword, which essentially gives you the sword and shield of the Wild Edge boss enemies in this game, which is awesome in my opinion, and that's one of the more boring power-ups here. You'll have to play the game to find out more about evolutions and their various forms, but suffice it to say, this is another excellent evolution of the Kirby formula, no pun intended. The sheer breadth of different abilities is honestly amazing and blows anything I was expecting way out of the water. The power-ups were always my favorite part of Kirby games, and this new system just makes them even more fun in my opinion. Next, let's talk about the very first thing I did when I started this game. It's something I do every time I start playing a Kirby game, and that is to measure how cheesable Kirby's hover is. In some earlier Kirby games, you can basically just fly over everything with hover and go as high as you like, but I am extremely pleased to say that is not the case with Forgotten Land. The height you can reach is limited by where you jump from, as well as any invisible ceilings that may be present, which prevents you from just soaring high into the sky out of reach of all the enemies. You also move very slowly while hovering in this game, and run out of air rather quickly, which also helps to alleviate this recurring problem with the Kirby formula. You can still do the old hover, breathe out to cover more distance, but you won't get too far with that thanks to the other limitations in place here. I gotta say, this is probably the best implementation of hover that I've seen in a Kirby game, and I'm super happy it happened to be in this game because the ground fighting and movement are all so much fun. One big reason for that is the new dodge feature, which works a lot like Witch Time from Bayonetta. You can dodge in any direction at any time you like, and if you time that dodge right before you get hit, you'll slow down time for a bit, allowing you to get some free hits in. This is very useful for boss fights in particular, and even if not truly necessary in some encounters, still makes the experience more fun in my opinion. There's nothing quite like the feeling of dodging a boss's big attack just in time and following up with some big damage of your own. That's another thing, at least as far as I can tell, timing dodges correctly will also allow you to start a charged attack from the middle stage, not the first, giving you a good incentive to incorporate some dodges into your rotation. You also have the ability to just fire off a dodge attack when in slowdown mode that does more damage than a normal attack would. The effectiveness does vary from ability to ability, of course, though. Overall, however, I'd say dodges and dodge attacks were a really great feature that it seems like a lot of people are missing out on because the game never really instructs you on how to use them. I'll just let you know here, just in case you were wondering. A dodge is performed by holding down guard, aka one of the triggers, and then moving the stick in the direction you'd like to dodge. It's very simple, but something you'll easily overlook if you don't specifically try to learn how to do it. Something that the game will force down your throat, however, is Kirby's new Mouthful mode. If you're familiar with the animal friends from earlier Kirby games, Mouthful mode is essentially this game's version of those. Kirby has the ability to fill his mouth with specific objects like cars, cones, vending machines, and water to transform into some new mode based on whatever he sucked up. Some are easy to understand, like if Kirby sucks up a car, he'll obviously become a car that drives around, but there's others that are a bit more abstract. For example, if Kirby sucks up a circle, that's actually the best way to describe what he sucks up, he'll become a fan that can shoot out bursts of air to accomplish various tasks. Now, I mention this all the time, but I love variety in my video games, and that is exactly what systems like the Mouthful mode bring to the experience. With each new form, Kirby can perform different duties like jumping over gaps with a car, breaking holes in the ground with a cone, or shooting a hole in the wall with a vending machine's soda cans. There's a total of like 15 of these Mouthful modes, which, as you can probably assume, means there's a lot of variation in how levels progress, where collectibles can be hidden, and how tasks can be completed. Like I said, they are essentially just the animal friends and how they function on a basic level, but unlike the animal friends, the level of difference in what each transformation does is vast. With the animal friends, you have like 5 guys who just let you jump because they're animals and animals have limitations, but with the Mouthful mode, you could literally have Kirby do anything you wanted, and the developers definitely took good advantage of that. I obviously have very high praise for the implementation of Mouthful mode, but if I did have to criticize it on one thing, it would be that I didn't particularly like that Kirby just kind of holds the stuff in his mouth. I would have personally preferred a proper transformation more akin to the power-up style of doing things, but I know a lot of people really like the way Mouthful mode looks. Just a small thing. Moving on to a different element of gameplay, the level design of Kirby and the Forgotten Land. It's just fine. Now let me first say, when I'm talking about level design, I'm purely speaking about the mechanics of a level and not how it looks or anything like that. And like I said, the design here was passable. Nothing really to write home about, but still definitely fun to experience once or twice. Pretty much every level goes something like this. Run through the first half defeating enemies with whatever power-ups you can find, maybe solve a puzzle and beat a mini-boss or two, and then complete that level's obligatory mouthful mode section that will probably lead to the end of the level. Now that's really simplifying things, but in general that's what a typical level will be like in this game. Don't get me wrong, every level I played was a ton of fun, and thanks to mouthful mode they all had a good deal of variety, but the core formula is pretty much the same across all levels. There also wasn't really a great deal of outside-the-box thinking when it comes to level design like you'd see in, say, a Donkey Kong Country game. There were a few things here and there that made me say, that's a cool idea, but those were very rare occurrences. One thing I specifically remember was a conveyor belt section that had you dodging sleep power-ups, because if you picked one up, you'd slow down and fall asleep, leading to the conveyor belt pushing you off the course. Taking the idea that power-ups are your friends that are meant to help you out and flipping that on its head is an example of outside-of-the-box thinking that really can help to make a level fun. I would have liked to see more levels throughout the game follow this kind of philosophy when it comes to level design. A good platformer, in my opinion, will rather than focus on getting from point A to point B, make the focus of the game what happens between points A and B, meaning that instead of making a level solely about basic platforming and combat meant to facilitate progression to the end of the level and beyond, they'll put more effort into making a level's mechanics unique and interesting to the player. There shouldn't be a discernible formula that applies to most if not all of your levels, because that means you run the risk of making the player bored, which is never a good thing. Now, of course, in Kirby and the Forgotten Land, we have variety in aspects like collectibles, mouthful mode sections, power-ups, and hidden rooms, so the formulaic nature of the level design isn't as big of a problem as it would be if the game was a more basic platformer, but that doesn't excuse the lack of variety in pure design here. If every level was designed to be as unique as that short conveyor belt section, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, but sadly, that wasn't the case. Now, the other main type of level in this game that I mentioned before are the treasure roads. The way they work is very straightforward, so we won't be spending too much time on them, but just for the sake of completion, I'll give you a quick synopsis. Treasure roads are basically time trials that will each individually require you to use a specific power-up and complete certain tasks. These tasks range from shooting targets to using the spike power-up to roll your way to the finish line. Complete these trials within a given time limit, and you'll get bonus coins in addition to the rare stone you'll get regardless of time. Rare stones are used to upgrade power-ups. Now, I don't really have a problem with the concept of these treasure roads. They're kind of fun if you're just doing them once or twice each, and they do sometimes teach you new ways to use abilities, which is cool, but there's just plain and simple too many of these suckers. I get that they wanted to have one for every level of every power-up, but come on, there's at least 3 times as many treasure roads as there are normal levels. I would have much preferred the developers put time into adding another stage or 2 per world than making more of these one-and-done gimmick trials. You could have easily halved the amount of these and been totally fine in my opinion. They're kind of optional, which is nice I guess, but if you're going for 100%, you better buckle up because you're probably going to be spending more time in treasure roads than you are in actual levels. Okay, up next, enemies and bosses. And once again, if you've played a Kirby game, you'll be more than familiar with many of the enemies that can be found in Forgotten Land. There's the bomb guys, the weird purple fly guys that are in literally every Kirby game, the Gordos, the sword guys, etc, etc. It's really only once we get to the Beast Pack enemies that things start to get new. The Beast Pack are this game's main antagonists, and like the name suggests, their ranks are made up of predominantly beasts. Some examples from early levels include the Awoofis, the big bull guys, the annoying rabbits that dodge every attack, and these weird lizard guys that live inside of a piece of sidewalk. Now, when it comes to enemies in a Kirby game, there's really not much to talk about in terms of mechanics. They pretty much all just have one main attack that they use, which isn't the most interesting thing to go over, so instead let's talk about visual design. As far as enemies that carry over from previous Kirby games go, they're a bit of a double-edged sword. There's nostalgia associated with those designs, which is always nice, but at the same time, you're not doing anything new and interesting by just using the same purple fly guy that's been in every Kirby game. The worst offenders of this are the power-up enemies in my opinion, because who really cares about the fodder guys, right? The most memorable enemies are the ones that give you power-ups, so seeing that 99% of these enemies are reused from other games was definitely a big disappointment. And also, each power-up corresponds to just one enemy, which was another letdown personally. Even Kirby 64 had multiple enemies for each power-up, and that game came out over 20 years ago. As for the new enemy designs, they're sadly all pretty boring. There are a few really good ones like the sidewalk lizards and the alligator guys with huge heads and tiny bodies, but for the most part they're all just basic animals. Maybe you could have leaned into the idea of the beast pack being like a gang or an army and given the enemies little outfits to represent that. I know Kirby enemies are traditionally rather simplistic in design, but this is the first full 3D platformer for the series, so I think it's about time we kicked things up a notch. Now the bosses have great designs. They do still follow the pattern of minimal clothing and accessories, but they still have so much more character when compared to the base enemies. My favorite was the armadillo guy because he's just so wacky and fun. He reminds me a lot of a Sly Cooper boss, and I absolutely love the bosses from that series. Setting visual design aside though, the bosses were actually a lot of fun from a mechanical standpoint as well. They weren't necessarily hard to beat, they'll probably take you only about 1 or 2 tries per boss, but much like the levels, difficulty wasn't the only factor when it came to fun. The mechanics each boss possesses are really fun to just avoid either through dodging or otherwise, and finding that perfect moment to get some good damage in is always an enjoyable experience in my opinion. However, I don't think the base bosses in this game would lend themselves too well to more than a few attempts, so it's a good thing they're pretty easy to get through. The later bosses, specifically those that come after the main story, are a completely different story though. They're still not going to take you too many attempts, but they're much more interesting. So much so that I actually wish I could have given them a few more goes before I took them down. The final boss, who I won't be showing, was actually a pretty good challenge and took me a decent number of tries to get through, which was a nice surprise. The amount of mechanics he has was off the charts when compared to other bosses, as was his damage and requirement of good dodging. Give the Coliseum a go if you want to see for yourself. All in all though, I'd say I really enjoyed the many boss fights in Kirby and the Forgotten Land. I'd even go as far as to call them a highlight of the experience, which definitely isn't something I'd say about many other Kirby games. Now we come to the artistic side of things, which I always enjoy talking about. Let's start with the visuals. Like the English title suggests, Kirby and the Forgotten Land is set in an abandoned world ruled by beasts, and that is nowhere more apparent than in the visual design of each level. There's decrepit shopping malls, long-forgotten factories, ruins of once thriving cities, and much, much more. I can't describe to you just how much I love this setting for Kirby. There's always been little references to past societies here and there in Kirby games, but this takes it to a whole new level. You're literally exploring an entire world that existed for years and years prior to you ever setting foot here, which just makes everything feel so mysterious and full of wonder. And that's all thanks to the excellent job the developers did at realizing this idea of a long-dormant world from a visual perspective. I also just love the graphical style of this game as well. It's living proof that Switch games can look really good if the art direction and style are on point. I hate to do this, but prime examples of the opposite in my opinion are the newer Pokemon games. They're Switch games with the same limitations as Forgotten Land, but they look so much worse. And in my opinion, that all comes down to art direction. How you use the limited assets available to you is way more important than just making a game higher fidelity. And last but not least, let's talk about music. Now, the music in and of itself is great, it's upbeat, it sets the mood very well for each level, and it brings back some nostalgia from Kirby games past, but the real accomplishment here is the amount of music present in this game. Pretty much every level has its own music, which is insane for a game of this size. But that's not all. Bosses have their own music, minigames have their own music, Waddle Dee Town has like 3 songs, every building in the town has its own music, it's a veritable smorgasbord of music. There's well over 100 tracks just for this little platformer that you can beat in a few days' time. The attention to detail here is just above and beyond, and I really can't emphasize that enough. Now, in terms of a few songs that really stuck with me from this game, I'd have to say the title theme and the music from the first level just wouldn't leave my head for days, even after I'd already 100%ed the game. If that's not a compliment to the composers, I don't know what is. Overall, though, the music was fantastic, and I have absolutely nothing bad to say about it. Another excellent soundtrack from HAL and Nintendo. Kirby and the Forgotten Land was a big step forward for the Kirby franchise. It's of course the first full 3D platformer in the series, which is definitely huge for Kirby, but that's not the only big leap taken by Forgotten Land. The power-up evolution system and mouthful mode bring a great level of variety and choice to the experience. The amount and quality of music in the game was stellar, and the passively told story is just super interesting and always had me itching to find out more. There are of course some downsides here as well, like the formulaic level design, the overabundance of treasure roads, and the bland enemies. These downsides, however, are far outshined by the positives present here in Kirby and the Forgotten Land, making this an overall excellent game in my opinion. I would 100% recommend this game to anyone even somewhat interested in what I talked about here today, so by all means pick it up if you feel so inclined. But anyway, that pretty much does it for this video. Thanks for sticking with me to the end, that always means a lot, and I hope you all enjoyed the review. If you did happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like, it's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Hack out. I'm actually really proud of that mouthful pun I made. Can we get a replay on that? Something that the game will force down your throat, however, is Kirby's new mouthful mode. Come on, you have to admit, that's a good one.